Welcome to our presentation this afternoon. I'm very happy to introduce you to Kathy Karatasas, who is the founder and CEO of CulturalWorks and a 2023 Churchill Fellow. Kathy is here in the US from Australia. She has spent her entire career advocating for and working and doing research in the area of child welfare in Australia. And she's going to talk to us today about the self-cultural framework, reflecting on approaches to keep children in foster care connected to their cultures in Australia. We sent you a brief little piece of information about Kathy's background, and I'm not going to reread that to you, but there are a couple of things that you don't know that I'd like to share with you. And one of them is Kathy actually has lived experience in terms of kinship care. She is of Greek Orthodox descent, and a family member of hers passed away. And the children of this family member were reared by someone in her family. They were actually 4 little children. And so she, as I said, has lived experience. She has spent over 4 decades advocating for and working for children, to enhance their lives, to connect them to their culture, and to make sure that they have family connections. I think that's enough about her background because I want to use this time for her to talk about her work and to give all of you the opportunity for us to have a discussion, ask questions. And so with that said, Kathy, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Harris, and a pleasure to be here, and always wonderful to share learnings and to have a dialogue, particularly as I was just saying to Ryan, you know, when there's an interest in multicultural issues and cultural issues for our children in foster care. So I'm going to start sharing the screen. Hopefully this is going to work straight away. That one.
There you go.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So the things that I wanted to talk about is we've had a paper that recently published called the Self-Cultural Framework, which I co-wrote with some of the elements around the self-cultural framework with you, to give you opportunities to think about how you may be able to consider culture and what it means for children from diverse cultural backgrounds in care. And the other thing that I wanted to also provide a background to is I've been involved in a 3-year national research with 3 other universities and 8 organisations in Australia, really focusing on the cultural connections for children from culturally diverse backgrounds. And when I talk about culturally diverse backgrounds, it's about children who are not identified as First Nations children. And it was a deliberate research to look at other children who are not First Nations, not because they're more or less important, but only because that is a significant gap in the work that and the research and the learnings that existed in Australia. And there is some overlay, but I just wanted to call that out. I also wanted to acknowledge the country and the lands that we're meeting on, which is also a traditional practice that we do in Australia, and acknowledge the history of the colonisation in Australia, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And in this piece of art is from a colleague of mine, Bradley Burns, who has given us permission to share, and it's changed through voices. And I love the colours that he has captured in this image. I won't go back into my background. That's Marion has covered that, and thank you very much for that, Marion. But what I did want to do before I talk about some of the research is just to put some things into context around the Australia's children in care. And basically, as at last year, we have 45,000 children in care And out of those children, about 50, just under 50% are identified as First Nations. That's significantly overrepresented, and I think that that's the similarities with Native Americans in the States. Our data, our information on what we identify children from multicultural backgrounds as culturally and linguistically diverse, that's a policy name that's evolved for many years now to try and identify other children who are either migrants or refugees, or where there is a difference, language or cultural, that requires a service provider to be aware of how they're responding to them. We're supposed to keep data on this group of children, but we don't do it consistently. But from the data that does exist, it looks like around 30% of our children come from different cultural backgrounds. In relation to Australia's sort of multicultural communities, that just gives you a snapshot in terms of the languages, ancestries, and religion of the sort of top 5 other than groups in terms of the demographic profiles around where English is the first language, but those 5 languages there are the other languages that are spoken. Not large percentages, probably around 15% in total, where most of the Australian population's ancestors reflect, and sort of the growing numbers of religions and non-religion, which is characteristic. There's a slide further down, it should have been here, that I just wanted to say, in the data too, nearly 50% of Australians identify a parent who is born overseas. So that just gives you the sense of cultural diversity. In terms of what culture means, I think we all have different views on what that can be for us and what we think it means for the children and families and that we're working with. But I just throw that open to you because I think it's one of those images that really highlights the potential differences between what we see and what we don't see that can influence children's and families' sense of what culture means. In relation to the national project, Upholding Children's Cultural Connections, it's been a 2-phase project and we're coming to the end of it. The first phase of that really looked at understanding the policies and the practices that exist in Australia to try and identify what are promising practices around doing better cultural connections. And the practices that we were particularly interested in are, I think, activities that we do in Australia a bit more intentionally than what I have picked up happens in the States. And that's about cultural care planning, cultural mentoring, and life story work, or cultural life story work. We wanted to understand the barriers to enhancing connections for children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And ideally, and we're up to, is shaping what that model can be going forward. So we did a desktop review and we did a series of focus groups across all the states. In relation to the high level, high level policy and legislations, one of the key things that Australia has and that we refer to is the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child. That's a constant reference and it's referred to in the legislation. We don't have federal legislation per se, but we do have national standards which enhance children's rights and reaffirm children's rights to be respected. And it particularly has a focus on Aboriginal children and Torres Strait Islander children in terms of what we need to do to ensure that they're connected. Less so for children from culturally and linguistically diverse. And that's reflected in most of the state laws. 2 states refer to cultural care planning specifically, New South Wales and Western Australia, and all the rest of them refer to it as aiming to focus on the child's best interests. And I think there's probably similarities with the states around that. In relation to sort of the 4 or 5 key themes that the policy makers, the cultural leaders and the specialists that we consulted with in phase 1, where we really wanted to understand how does culture come through in terms of practice and policy. We, as I said, had a series of focus groups, or world cafes, we referred to them, and 5 main themes came up. The first one was this challenge that when we're talking about culture and identity, what is it that we're talking about? And how do we actually define what culture is? There was references to culture emerging through conversations and relationships and rituals and rhythms and so forth. But the complexity of it in terms of how to define it was identified as a common challenge. And the advocacy was, can we come up with a definition of what we're talking about when we're referring to culturally and linguistically diverse children, so that we can be more consistent in that practice. The second theme that came up was the question of whose role is it to support culture for a child in care, and a strong sense that it's the family's role. You know, birth parents have a strong responsibility for it. It's about the child's identity. But issues that came up were related to when birth parents or birth families are not showing, indicating a strong sense of cultural identity. So carers, this sense of coming through from a practice, why should we nurture a cultural tradition if the parent is not necessarily practicing it or speaking the language or practicing the faith? Some of the barriers that we identified, which I think is probably shared here with the states, are things about the system being really complex. There's lots of levers that we need to get through, and best practice gets overwhelmed with the practical realities, finding a placement, nurturing and dealing with the trauma, managing court matters, managing school, all those other things that need to be given attention to often means that we don't give attention to cultural connections. And because it's not counted consistently in terms of we don't count the children consistently, that sense of we don't care about what we don't count or we don't count well. There's a layer of dismissiveness that was identified that the system supports. And then other common things were around the structural racism, which is around the way a westernized view on how we do assessments or what we expect of parents, and the dismissiveness of father roles and so forth came through. And in terms of facilitators, things that can improve the system, repeatedly there was a sense of we need to give weight to children's voices. Let's start showcasing what excellence what it looks like what are the examples? People are doing it. There's pockets of good practice that was being identified, but how do we keep showcasing that and sharing that so that people can learn? How can we strengthen the partnerships with multicultural community leaders too, so that we can learn from other experts in the field as practitioners supporting children and carers and parents? How can we learn around cultures by working with multicultural leaders? And how do we co-design, bring them in better so that we can engage the community, reach out to the community for kinship of foster carers? So is that resonating so far? A few nods? Thank you. In terms of the second phase, which we then, so that sort of put the structure and the context of what the landscape looked like in Australia. And then we wanted to hear the voices of the key stakeholders. So we interviewed children and carers and parents, and again, practitioners or caseworkers or social workers closer to the field. And these, I'm just sharing with you sort of the preliminary findings of the voices of some of those stakeholders. So this was something that the children and young people were telling us again and again. The theme that came out was, I need to trust the person I'm talking to. I notice when it's not authentic. Trust was, again, a key point that children referred to, whether it was around their caseworker, their carer, or friends. So that first comment is around a child's relationship with a friend in school. The trust element or untrust, the distrust came through when talking to caseworkers around cultural care, and they felt it was a tick box. They felt like there was somebody's project. The caseworker was doing this for themselves or for their system, not necessarily because it was something that was of value and meaning. It was it had the intent that it was supporting the child. And for kids, again, children were again saying that their identity, knowing their history was important, as that message from that young man talks about, and wanting to know about his dad's history in Gambia. In relation to the parents' voices, there were some interesting comments that came through and worries from them. First, about losing rituals and communication and language. So when children were placed with carers who didn't share the same language or weren't practicing the same routines, they were really worried that the children were losing that sense of cultural connection. You know, I taught him to, when he's eating, he says some basic words like basmala, and when you finish, you say, thanks God. And this mum said, and even this forgot my child, these two words. So really important things for her, they were being lost. Parents also called out for this concept of life story work. Life story work is a practice that we do in Australia, which records the day-to-day activities and the milestones and achievements for children when they're in care. Not so much in file notes, but in a storybook that reflects the child's age. And parents were saying, I wish I had something like that too, because I forgot what was happening to me. I was in a crisis. I can't remember things. I was angry. I was reactive. I didn't have that information. So that sense of having a narrative for them was something that came up with. I think that was quite different. I hadn't heard that sort of response in the past. Concepts around culturally sensitive assessments, the misjudgments that were made of what was a cultural practice and what was a parenting capacity issue was suggested that there was misalignment between some of those misinterpretations and judgments made in terms of what was a cultural issue. And fathers in particular asked for more advocacy for themselves when they wanted to resume the care of their child. So one father said, I wanted to go to a support program. I wanted to develop my skills. I had no idea what to do with his 5-year-old, and all the support groups were targeted primarily for mums. So he felt like he didn't have access to that. In relation to the carers, now that's a breadth of issues that carers have raised. Most of them all raise this sense of culture is important. It's important for me, and it's also important for the child. That came through fairly consistently. The way that they took on the role to be involved in activities and to socialize the child, to collect information, to support the parents, and to be creative in that way really varied. The ones that really appreciated the diversity, you could see creativity, their interest in learning the child's language, in going to community or cultural leaders and learning about the child's culture. For others, it was a sense that it wasn't their duty, it wasn't their role. It was the parents' role to share the child's cultural history. It wasn't necessary. They questioned to what extent it was theirs. But consistently, connections to community and the value of it were important. And the other issue that came up was around developmentally. When do children appreciate and understand cultural connections? So that last comment reflects carers' views who thought that younger children can't really, it's not as important for them to be culturally connected as a 4-year-old. 4-year-olds just play was the example of this carer. But other carers who were culturally responsive would talk about the 2-year-old listening to a Vietnamese child listening to Vietnamese songs and nursery rhymes and having books, and being able to be exposed to culture, to different cultures from a very young age. And the key views around practitioners, very much so, that concept around wanting to know more about different cultures and where to go and get that information, and to help them plan a cultural care plan. So one of the responsibilities we have in our court proceedings and in our ongoing care, both for Aboriginal children and for multicultural children, is that service providers are expected to do an annual plan that complements the permanency plan or the case plan. And that outlines what the intent is in the year ahead to understand and maintain family and cultural connections, but also to do activities and build relationships that will expose the child to their culture that's age-related and developmentally considered. The practitioners also talked about getting more assistance in documenting life story work, and again, connecting to community groups and mentors. So there's a sense of we need help, we need assistance. We don't know how to be able to be responsive to children's cultural diversities. So in summary, the sort of preliminary emerging themes is that there is a wide breadth of practices and diverse stakeholder interests on cultural care planning and its purpose and how to do it well. There's a sense that there's a lack of information and support received by carers to provide cultural experience for children in care. They want more. One carer sort of said, can I have a dial and auntie, to culture X and culture Y? Tongue in cheek, but we understand what she was trying to say. The question of responsibility for cultural connection, particularly when we're talking about long-term carers here, permanency carers, is seeing that role really sits with birth parents when their culture doesn't align with the children's. The ways that children's developmental stages impact how carers and children prioritise cultural activities is an emerging issue. And the impact of both the caseworkers and the carers' views around promoting cultural connections. If caseworkers saw value in it, there was intentional conversations and a sense of more authentic work, and the same for carers. So that brings me, I'll just quickly pause. Is there any question that you want to ask me around that study before I move into sort of the cultural matching and the self-cultural, the development of the self-cultural framework?
I have a question, Kathy. I'm wondering if you could go into just a little more detail about cultural care planning, because that's not something that's done here.
Yeah.
We do permanency planning. If you could talk a little more about cultural care planning, I think that would be helpful.
Yep. Yep.
And I know that you actually have a tool that you utilize for care planning.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I was going to get through to the self-cultural framework to guide that. But essentially, the cultural support plan or cultural care plan is, as I said before, an intentional plan that is tailored somewhat, but essentially it's about, so the ones that CulturalWorks that we use with, and that I used in the organization, the program that I ran, we will do a plan that has an overview of the child's basic demographics and age and so forth, and then their cultural details at least their ethnicity, language and faith, and their settlement. That the settlement experience has evolved more recently, but their ethnicity, their language and faith, and how that relates to who in their extended family, the maternal or the paternal side. So mine, for example, would have been Greek ethnic background, paternal and maternal, because both my parents were Greek, born in Greece and migrated to Australia, and I was born in Australia. My faith was Greek Orthodox and my language was English and Greek. So I had one culture, and that's sort of the cultural overview. Then we have a snapshot, as a fairly brief, a few paragraphs on the child's story. What's their story to date? So where are they up in relation to the permanency, and what do we feel comfortable and they feel comfortable sharing about why they're in care, and what we know about mum and dad or the family. We will then spend a section of the plan understanding the family's heritage. We'll go through both parents in the first instance, their age, where they were born, their extended family. We'll add a genogram if we've got it, or talk about updating that. When did the family member migrate, say, to the States? Was it grandparents? Was it themselves? Which side of the family? Where were they from? And the same for the father. So you're trying to get that historical information, both of people's names, and details of where they've come from. And then we'll flag, well, what do we want to know more about mum in the year ahead? What cultural questions might be we thinking about? So do we want to know more about, so I've just got one in front of me, the Hungarian mum. Do we want to know about what Hungarian cultural foods did she like as a child? Where specifically in Hungary did her mum, was her mother born? What words did she really, did she learn that were Dutch? What foods may have been important to her? And you'll do the same for the father side of the family, and the same for the carers. So we'll try and get a snapshot of the carers. We'll then outline who are the family members and the significant friends or relationships and other people of importance to this child, and name them and map out how often or what's our current relationship. So if they're seeing them, we'll note that we're seeing them monthly or fortnightly. If they're not, we might note that and think about, is this a relationship we want to try and reconnect to in the year ahead? If there's a cultural care plan that was done the year before, we'll reflect on that. What did we say that we were going to do, and where did we get up to? And then specifically, we'll look at a plan in the year ahead, and we'll look at those three elements around ethnicity, language, and faith as guides, and list a series of tasks and note where we can. Can we do this in the next 6 months? Can we do it in the next 3 months? Will it take us the best part of the year to focus on?
Thank you.
Thank you. So in relation to, I want to share how we evolve, what some of the steps in devising the self-cultural framework. So in 2012, at the time in New South Wales, the reform, the child welfare reform at the time was basically saying that government organisations were saying, we're not looking after children in foster care as well as the non-government sector, and we will move more of our children from our care to the non-government sector. And that process started. An organisation that I was working with at the time had a huge history of working with adults in the migration and humanitarian settlement, and put its hand up to start an out-of-home care, a foster care program. And I joined them to start developing a specialist multicultural foster care program. So we got 30 children initially referred from government, and over the 10 years, we've cared for 700 children, and I was with that organisation for the next 10 years. But some of the first things that we started looking at was trying to explore what is it that we're actually looking at, because we were advocating that we would want to match children from multicultural backgrounds to carers. And that first cohort of children and carers that came out, we broadly identified them as the Arabic-speaking group, a Vietnamese-speaking group, and a Turkish-speaking group. The Arabic-speaking group had Arabic-speaking children with Arabic-speaking carers. The Vietnamese children were generally with kin and or psychological, cultural family members. But the Turkish carers, the thing that they had in common was that they were mostly Turkish carers, and they had no cultural connections with their children, but they had joined, they had participated in and been recruited as foster carers at the same time. So when we were looking at some of the children's and the carers' relationships with parents, it came to our attention that we needed to explore some of these questions, because we had an Arabic-speaking child with an Arabic-speaking carer, but that child's family was Lebanese Christian, and the carers were an Arabic-speaking Muslim family. And there were questions being asked around, to what extent could faith be, could the carers take the child to church? Was it their place? Who else could do that? So we started exploring, what is it that we're talking about when we're looking at a cultural match? Is it around a child with the same ethnic background? Is it a child that has the same faith background or a faith connection, but maybe not a language? What are some of the other issues that can impact a child's placement with a carer, particularly where there's been a refugee or a humanitarian settlement, and there may be issues still happening in country of origin that are impacting the child's family and the carers? So we really were trying to unpack, what is it that we're really looking at when we're looking at cultural matching? And 3 elements really stood out for us: as ethnicity, language, and faith. So we started exploring and counting that information around our children, because all we knew when we got them essentially from government was that they were multicultural. So these 3 elements, keeping this data for children and for carers, allowed us to understand the diversity of the children's profiles. And this table really highlights the individual characteristics of children. So there, at one point in time, this is for 250 children, they represented 60 different ethnic groups, 40 different languages, and 15 different faith groups. And that's not the intersection between them. So there was nuances between that. And this didn't recognize, or what we also needed to note, that children can have more than one culture. If their mum's from one ethnic background and a faith and speaks a language, and their dad's from another one, then the diversity of their cultural profile can be more complicated. But what it had allowed us was to understand that ethnicity, language, and faith allowed us to understand some of those cultural nuances. And over time, we also realized that settlement journey, how long somebody had migrated and been in Australia. So the grandparents, for example, the Vietnamese grandparents who had lived in Australia for many, many years, but English was still their second language, were challenged when they needed to care for their grandchild whose English was their only language. They hadn't learnt Vietnamese. So assumptions around migration and assumptions around refugee statuses and experiences of trauma and acculturation were presented themselves as another issue. And to that extent, the self-cultural framework evolved, and it allows us to use those 4 elements, those 4 prompts, those 4 lenses to facilitate questions so that we can better understand children and families that we're working with and understand what culture might mean for them. So they're prompts to essentially ask curiosity questions. So the one around settlement helps consider, was this family, the child's family or the carers, arriving as a refugee or as a migrant? Was it one that they wanted to do, or was it one that they felt forced to do? Are they first or subsequent generations? Because that will give us a sense of understanding how much they may have adjusted to different cultures in Australia. Asking around their experiences before settlement, as well as their experiences in Australia. Many families talk about that assimilation or sense of having to change their names or having to change practices or eat food. Some do it wholeheartedly and happily, and others feel a sense of pressure to do that. So exploring using these questions as prompts can give you a sense of what traditionally is important, or what traditionally has been an experience for a child, a family, or carers. In terms of ethnicity, the curiosity questions encourage thinking around what's important, which countries, what's the social heritage, are there more than one country? What's the history that was important to this family? What connections are still maintained? Many people will talk to you around that things have often, for people who have migrated, say, to Australia and the US, when they go back to their country of origin, many traditions have moved on, and they're not necessarily the format that practice in the same way as what migrants often practice them in their new country. They hold on. Many migrants hold on to traditional practices that are less practiced or in countries of origin. So how important are those traditions? And how important are certain foods, behaviours and dress codes? And what are some of those gender roles that might be important for that particular family? In relation to language, again, what's the spoken language? What's the terminology? What's the dialect? How fluent is English? Because I think I've shared this with Dr. Harris. In our sort of broad umbrella of culturally and linguistically diverse, Americans, English, Scots, Irish, New Zealand don't have culture because we all speak English and we all share the same language. And if anybody hears that comment, you think that is so seriously not true. We have such a unique culture that is shared through language and that isn't shared through language. We use the words that I have heard in the States so far are words that I'm familiar with, but they're used in different contexts. So that terminology and that dialect is really important. Growing up in Australia, I learned a new language. I thought it was Greek. And when I went to Greece and used some words, they were very foreign. And one example is as a younger adult, I was going to say young adult in my 20s, I'll say younger adult, when I went to Greece and I wanted to buy a cup with my mum and dad's name on it, which was, often you do those sort of coffee cups. And I walked into the shop and I said to the lady, and I thought I spoke fluent Greek, and I said, can I have a cuppi with my dad's name on it? And the shop assistant said, excuse me? I said, I want a cuppi. And she said, excuse me. And so I said it louder and slower, thinking that that's all I needed to do. Cuppi. And then I went, cuppi. And she goes, oh, you want a flidzani. So the Greek word for cup is flidzani. In Australia, as a Greek Australian, the word kapi is what we used. So people of my parents' generation and Maltese and Italian, I've heard this shared, they picked up English words and added Greek sounds to the end. So kap, I, o, a, common sounds at the end of words. So kap, I, floor, I, roof, I, were words that were Greek Australians. They're not Greek words. But I thought I spoke Greek fluently. So I'm just trying to share how language can change over time. So looking at what language is used for a child and family is worth exploring. And then in terms of faith, being curious around views and practices and rituals, because you can have two Christian people or two Catholic people, two Islam people who follow the Islam faith, and their routines and their approach may be very different. And we fell into that challenge when we were placing children of Islam faith with carers, but the children's family didn't practice Islam in a conservative way, and carers did. So we were exposing children to new rituals and routines. And in and of themselves, these are not issues that you just don't consider. It's about considering what the impact will be on the child's routine and the relationship between the child, the parent, and the carer. So we use those 4 prompts, the settlement, ethnicity, language, and faith, both for cultural care planning and in conversations with our home visits. That was a slide that I was trying to share with you before around Australia's multicultural communities and the 46% of parents born overseas. And in the practice of what we did, we encouraged our practitioners, if culture wasn't connected, encouraging them to at least start with connecting a child with at least one person who represented their ethnicity, language, and faith. And that's not a comprehensive, that doesn't mean that's where the full stop ends, but it was an encouragement around building blocks. Now, whether that person is a family member, a community member, a school member, or whether it's speaking a language or being exposed to song, the practice that I encouraged and expected, the accountability was 100% achievable, that every child was connected to at least one aspect of their culture and then nurtured further on. In terms of cultural care planning, that's probably a snapshot of what it includes, sort of planning, the family genogram. I also do cultural booklets to complement cultural care plans, and I'll show you that in the next slide. But basically, cultural booklets aim to provide some education and knowledge for carers and for children where that's helpful around their country of origin. And it's used as a tool to start a conversation, especially where children may not have had much exposure to cultural activities because other child protection and child safety issues have been impacting them. And that is a collection of some information that might be included, that's been included in a cultural booklet sample for a little boy from Poland and from Indonesia. So it's age appropriate. It provides lots of photos of the country, talks about where it is, encourages questions to identify where specifically in the country grandparents or parents may have come from, encourages information around language and greetings and national and religious days, anthems, foods, celebrities, sports stars. For these children, animals were important, so animals were something we included. And some of this information will carers or family members may have different views on, and that's okay, is my approach, because it's a conversation piece to allow a pathway to connection. In terms of cultural life story work, we think that cultural connections and cultural care planning and that approach to keeping a child connected to at least one person that shares a cultural element has contributed to better cultural life story work. So where cultural care planning is about planning those cultural experiences and nurturing cultural relationships, the life story workbook is about capturing that information in a way that can be a narrative and a story for children as they stay in care. That complements, ideally, file records. And it can look anything like that sample. It can be a journal, it can be lots of pictures in boxes, it can be whatever suits the child and carer. But it's an expectation that it is kept, a record is kept outside the case file notes for the child that considers their age and development. And just two more slides. So a lot of them, I know I'm throwing a lot of information to you. The other key areas that I really encourage building that cultural responsiveness, and I guess from your roles, how you can support colleagues who you're working with who are giving attention to children's cultural issues, is that sense of reflecting on your own biases, thinking and knowledge. We all have ideas around how we expect different people to behave, but thinking about the assumptions and the thoughts that you might have about different cultural groups. Seek some information, seek to learn, ask questions, be curious so you can gain a better understanding and encourage others to do that. Really think about the communication and communicating with families in language, ideally. And I know you've probably heard this before, but avoiding using the jargon and that we can use in our courts and our welfare system. Collaborate wherever possible with other people who share a child's culture, family, of course, extended family, of course, community, colleagues, and also think about the context. So while culture is important, the other issues will also play an impact, whether it's a recent migration, whether it's poverty, whether it's a substance issue, housing issue, other issues contribute to that context for that child and family. And collectively, that builds that process of cultural respect and cultural humility. And I vary between 5 and 40 tips. I thought I'd summarize it just in 5 tips. Where possible, try and communicate in language. And can I reinforce that there's so many cultures within cultures. And that's for every element. It's not a homogenous group. And encourage you to be curious and informed, and whether you do your homework or you ask questions, but please be curious to understand what culture means for this particular child. Think about your own thoughts and attitudes and check them out in a safe way with colleagues as best you can, and really try and collaborate with other people, other leaders, other mentors, because they can help strengthen that partnership and give that message that we keep hearing from children and parents about being authentic. And that was a lot of slides, and I've rushed through them, and so I'll just pause there. Pause there. And really happy to hear any questions, any comments around what may resonate, what may not for you in your role and in your work. Or if there's anything else that I know you wanted to talk a bit about Aboriginal children and what's different for our Aboriginal placements. And so if there's any questions, please throw them out. I'm really happy to hear them.
Kathy, I am struck by how similar our two systems are. I was hoping that you guys had figured it all out and you were here to give us all the answers about how we can do this work. But just listening to you, you have permanency plans, you have like it's the same language, which I don't know how I feel about. Like that seems really weird to me that you guys have the same issues that we do too, and how the state doesn't take care of their kids the right way. And we seem to have this vacillation between, is it better for kids to go into nonprofits that we call them here, like those types of environments, or does the state provide better care? And I've been around long enough to kind of see that pendulum go back and forth. So
I think what I'd say is that we do have, I've picked that up too, Ryan, there are lots of similarities. People need the same sort of care. You know, all our kids and families all want the same in life. There's a lot to do when we take on accountability and statutory care, and the system tries to audit and have standards around X, Y, and Z in ways that we don't do in our that we don't talk about with families for good reasons, you know, in terms of history. But being curious, it's the relationship. I think there's probably three things that I would say shift the dial a bit, and it is about helping people at the front end to be curious and to give attention in a meaningful way to conversations with parents and carers and calling things out. We have a lot of new staff too, young staff who don't stay on board very long and don't build that practice expertise. So that other lever around what do managers do in organizations to facilitate, build staff's confidence and keep those conversations going and encourage that learning to do that. Because these things didn't happen 10 years ago in the agency that I ran. This group was involved, a representative from that agency was involved in the group that in the research with the university, and I didn't share that, but I looked at the readings and the data from the practitioners groups around what works, and it was a joy to hear staff, my colleagues, not knowing that I was listening, repeating things that I had said to them. So it does evolve over time, that culture of support, the culture of valuing conversations with family and appreciating that is as important as a child getting to school and going home. So if we start discounting some of those well-being measures, it contributes to us going backwards, and we've already got a slippery slope. And so seeing it where it does and showcasing it where it does provide an opportunity to learn. And for me, it's also about the executive collecting and the data and valuing culture for all children and giving time to do that.
One of the things that our system is looking at, and we'll be looking at a little bit more closely over the next year, is how to basically capture data or evaluate a program. I'm curious how I'm sure you get the same thing. How do we know that this works? Why are we wasting money, or why are we spending money on this? You know, how did you overcome that, and kind of what do you use for data points, so to speak?
Yeah. Hence why so there's a report that's just come out about the New South Wales and Australian government system, and its criticism is that its data, despite a new program, just hasn't quite got it right. As I said before, we started counting ethnicity, and what that did was it counted families and it counted conversations with families. So that was what was important. Getting the voice of kids as they're getting older, again and again, their 17-year-olds, our 18-year-olds, our 16-year-olds, our 20-year-olds, talk about how grateful they were that they were connected to their culture and we didn't give up on that. So that voice validating how important culture is for children as they mature. So yes, it's a balance between what data we collect now and what data we're going to collect into the future. Because of course, the future highlights this, there's evidence again and again and again, which talks about if we don't do this, then we're going to have these problems in families as they grow older, and the cycle will be reciprocated. Showcasing the good stories of again and again is critical, and advocating for prevention. Children do better when we can support them with their families. Yeah. But it's got to be practical. It's got to be practical and doable, and more than just the caseworker doing it. I think that's one of the strengths that we found when executive were interested in the data, and managers were interested in the data, and caseworkers were interested in the data, and it was meaningful. Like, who did you connect with culture, and showcasing that? It was meaningful and people could see that connection. It seems to have a domino effect. If you're just doing something for the sake of just ticking a box or trying to be transcriptive, our job, it can't be completely transcriptive. There's quality that goes into it, and intuition and so forth that you can't measure, which makes it tricky, I think, because we use checklists to validate the system. So I haven't answered your question easily, but I think you've got to value the data that you collect, and collect it continuously in a meaningful way. Yeah. What do you see as a main problem in the collection of data? Is it at the caseworker level, or at the state, or the complexities of so many different views between the counties and the states?
I think it's finding the right set of data that people are interested in, because we can collect data all day long, right? But so much of it is, I think so much of what we focus on is on output data, right? Like, were they assigned a volunteer? How long were they in care? Like those sorts of things, that not really getting at, are we really helping these kids and families, right? And so trying to make that, I think the system is trying to make that shift over to that. Are we doing right by these kids and families? But we're struggling with how to measure that on a, we can do it on an anecdotal case by case level, but not necessarily on that system wide.
Yeah. Yeah. And the change, I think, for me, this is my personal views. We're not measuring the impact of change of staffing in the system. So that to me is a significant lever in the system. When a caseworker moves on, another person comes on, that discontinuity of narrative and story and data is very impactful. So what can we do better at keeping that thread of information more timely? And I think it is up to how do we document a change? How does a caseworker document that when they're moving on? How do they explain their relationship is changing to the child? And there's opportunities to do that in life story work, I think, for us. But I think there's something there that's missing. And the other bit is, there's two bits. One is we duplicate a lot. We seem to collect the same information on some aspects again and again and again. And there are other people who can give us some information. So there's data from education or health that we don't need to keep. So that intersection there is an opportunity to strengthen how data is shared. And certainly a colleague has been looking at the human services data and what can be shared between child welfare, for example, education and health in particular, because there's a lot of stuff that can be shared there in that sense. And those departments also have a responsibility to contribute to the care of children in that respect. Yeah.
So this is just a Australia question. How are our children represented? So here we have volunteers, we have attorneys. I'm just curious, how are the voice of the children in court proceedings?
Yeah.
How are they kind of elevated?
We're not, their solicitor represents them. So theoretically, the department is representing their voice, and then they have a solicitor who represents the child's voice in court, and the parents would have another representative. So we don't have advocates for the child in the courts in that sense. Hence why it's so important to have that relationship with the child and the practitioner.
Just as a follow-up, because Karina's on here too. She's one of our solicitors, but
Yeah.
she's an attorney. Is the solicitor's role to represent what the child wants or the best interests? Because that's one of the things that what is that? Sorry.
Best interests.
Best interests.
Yeah.
How do they ascertain that, especially for children?
From the record, yeah. So children over the age of 12, they need to interview them. Children under the age of 12, they read records, the information from the records, and consultation with the departmental representatives and or the not-for-profit representatives there. So that's the other challenge in our system, is that the not-for-profit organisation is not a party to the proceedings unless they've been invited to. And so the Department of Community and Justice represents the not-for-profit. And when there are different views, then the not-for-profit has the right to ask to become a party, but needs to represent themselves.
Sounds like you guys are just as confusing as we are over here. But, and then finally too, so one of the things that we do here, we treat our Native American cases differently. So if basically that if a child or their parents were enrolled in a tribe or enrollable in a tribe, they have a whole set of different rules and laws. I'm just curious if you guys have anything like that in Australia when it comes to the Aboriginal, and kind of just briefly kind of what that looks like, maybe compare and contrast.
So our work is mirrored on what the Aboriginal children and Torres Strait Island principles are. It's mirrored in that somebody from the child's family and an Aboriginal organisation, not necessarily connected to the country or the land, but an Aboriginal organisation needs to be involved in the child's care. At the moment, there is a significant shift and agencies are working towards this. It was supposed to start 10 years ago. It's really taking a move now that children who are First Nations being cared for by non-First Nations agencies, which are essentially most, have to be transitioned to an Aboriginal community controlled organisation. And that is in train now. So the next, I think it's 2 to 5 year, 2 year to 5 year, and moving in this financial year, all children who have been cared for by mainstream not-for-profit organisations, where they are not placed, and where they're certainly not placed with Aboriginal carers or kinship carers, need to be moved to Aboriginal community controlled organisations. There's a push towards it, and there's the resistance was, you know, bureaucratic and so forth, and there's layers to it. But essentially the demonstrating a connection to an Aboriginal community, connection to family, connection to land and your mob needs to be presented to the Children's Court. So that's probably where the parallel is. There's an expectation that the principles need to be demonstrated why this child is not placed with their kin and or non-Aboriginal kin and or immediate family member or as close to the family member, and that concept of self-determination has been demonstrated. But that said, the advocates for Aboriginal children would say that we're nowhere near where we need to be.
Unfortunately, that sounds very similar to over here as well.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, just because we hear these arguments all the time, but the child has been with me all of its life, and now you're going to put him with this culture that they don't understand and they don't know. I'm just curious if that rings
Very
true for you.
so.
Yeah.
I guess it's the same way too, Ryan, is when somebody says, oh, this child's not connected to their culture, so why do they need to be connected now? Or I'll respond to their interests when they show me that they're interested in it. Well, if we're not exposing them to it, how are they going to know what to develop their interests? And, you know, you don't ask them every day, do you want to go to school or do you want to go to the dentist? You take on that responsibility to expose the child to that. And my position is very much just on that. It's our responsibility to provide the opportunities to explore and learn. If the child doesn't want to do it, that's their choice. But our responsibility is to nurture that information, to have it available for them as part of their history, and they can choose to do what they want to do it as and when they choose. In relation to does the child want to stay here or not, if there's an Aboriginal carer or a kin carer that that is able to look after the child, that does take precedence. Ideally, if the child's been with a carer and there's conversations with the extended family that that carer is able to manage permanency and continue to connect the child to their Aboriginal community and family, that would be the goal you would work towards, and case by case. So examples now that I've been called in on have been where the children are First Nations and have another cultural diversity, and they've been living with their grandmother, for example, of the Macedonian culture, and that's all they know, and they're connected to that, and this mother is connected to the agency. She doesn't want to go to an Aboriginal agency. So the question then is, how do you partner with the other agency? How do you partner with and support the carer to bridge and relationship and connections that she hasn't had before? And that might take some more time. But it has to be around opening up and exploring what the fears are. And most people value family. And as you build relationships, you give time to people, whether it's with a community leader or another friend or somebody you work with somebody else, you can nurture conversations that over time can bring you to the same goal. But you need to give that time and to treat it and be focused on what you're trying to achieve, which is keeping this child connected to their family. Yeah. Yeah, it's a complex area that we work in, and ideally it would be great if there were easier solutions, but the responsibility is big, and yeah, it's huge for kids not to be able to live with their families, and working towards that is a huge goal. And when we do it well, it works well. And we've got to believe that there is benefits in that. And for us who have been in the industry for a while, to continue to advocate as we do, and keep hoping that things will improve with our voice and our collective interests.
Well, Kathy, or even Dr. Harris, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with us, or before we say goodbye?
I don't have, I want to thank Kathy, first of all, for taking the time to come and talk to us. And I'm wondering, when you have time, if you could send us a copy of these Aboriginal child placement principles. I would like to just compare them to the Indian Child Welfare Act.
Sure. Yeah. I can do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's nice to see you all. It's been a full day. I know what it's like. You've got back-to-backs, and then you're also trying to learn and be curious in a lunchtime break. It's pretty tricky. So thank you for your interest and your
Wondering
contribution.
though, if anyone else here has questions.
I'm not seeing any. So, Kathy, I know you've got a flight to catch and you've been busy. So you're in Detroit now, but now you're flying back over to here. So let's let you go so that you can get ready to go. And I really appreciate your time. And I look forward to maybe some future conversations as well. So thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. And I will have this posted to YouTube, hopefully in the next day or two. So
stay well, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Nice to see you all.
Thanks.
Bye.